I had $600 left from my fellowship, and I was thinking I was going to have to get a real job. I remember my father was a tough old bird. He said to me, "Who do you think you are, Ernest Hemingway?" And I said to him, because I was a smart ass, I said to him, 92 in the Shade project was really strange, and I'll tell you how strange. After cocaine arrived, it was a lot of guns, a lot of violence. My mother, father, and sister died in a short window, but after those 3 deaths, I just couldn't handle alcohol anymore. Everybody knows they're going to die, but nobody believes it.
First of all, this is my voice. I'm Tim Green, and I have ALS. This podcast is not about ALS or living with disabilities. I don't want you to feel sorry for me. I don't feel sorry for me. I am a father of 5 with a marriage that's lasted for over 33 years. I am a #1 New York Times best-selling author of 41 books, an NFL first-round pick with an 8-year career. I worked on TV for Fox Sports, Good Morning America, Court TV, and Extra. I've hosted BattleBots, A Current Affair, and Find My Family. And I am also a practicing attorney. In this podcast, we're diving into real-life stories. From triumphs to trials, we'll explore the extraordinary in the ordinary. Join me, Tim Green, and my son Troy each week for real conversations, laughter, and insights. Because life is a journey, and everyone's got a story. My voice in today's episode is powered by 11 Labs. Tom McGuane, it is such an honor to speak to you. I am in awe of your writing, and you have lived the lives of 10 normal men. I'm going to go through just a couple of your different journeys. Your life in Hollywood as a screenwriter, producer, and director, marrying Peter Fonda's wife first and swapping her out for movie star Margot Kidder of Superman Acclaim. Your life in Key West as a fishing guide, a writer for Sports Illustrated, rubbing elbows with the likes of Tennessee Williams and Truman Capote, a novelist of literary acclaim. Your life in Montana as a rancher, a short story writer, and a Hall of Fame writer. And I probably left something out. Oh, Margot only lasted 2 years, but the third time was the charm with Jimmy Buffett's sister, Lori, and you two have been married for a long time. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, boy, I'm just exhausted hearing that list. Yeah, it's amazing to me. I mean, there aren't a lot of people who've been married 3 times who've been married for 46 years this time. So it was, I guess I had to kind of warm up before I could get it right. But let me say that it's a pleasure to talk to you today. And Carl told me the same thing. And so thanks for making space for me.
We want your life story, but first I want to jump to this Hollywood scene and Margot Kidder because people are fascinated by these sorts of things. Were you directing the film where this went down, or were the screenwriters? And was the whole thing based on your novel 92 in the Shade? Please tell us the whole story. You were romantically involved with 2 of the day's biggest stars.
Well, it was very entertaining, you know. I wish I could remember it better. I really need to these days. But, you know, I look back on that. That was really my marriage to Margot Kidder. It was actually much shorter than that. And I would say it was a kind of a mistake, except that we had 1 child. And she's been my best friend, that child. She has 2 kids, my grandchildren. They both went to public school in Montana. And Maisie, my granddaughter, last year graduated magna cum laude from Harvard. And her brother graduated magna cum laude from Penn a year later. So when I look back at it as a mistake, and I think about having those guys out of my life, I don't think of it as a mistake anymore. So, but that was the 70s. I mean, the 70s was an era of sort of pushing the limit, I think, And, the great English poet John Keats said, how do you know what's too much? How do you know what's enough until you find out what's too much? And that was kind of our guiding policy. And clearly a lot of it was a little bit over the line.
So what's the story behind it? Were you on set, or how did that work? How did that all come to be?
I can't, Margot was an interesting person. She had 155 IQ. She was teaching school when she was 13 years old, and she grew
Wow.
up in Yellowknife, Northwest Territory. So she came from, almost a wilderness kind of background. And then she was a beauty and very ambitious, and she went on to be a movie star. So her life was too much for her really to absorb, and she didn't handle it very well. And as you probably know, she committed suicide. So um, that was fundamentally a sad story. But her daughter, our daughter, and the grandchildren have been so successful so far that I'm just grateful. They're all my kids and all my grandchildren are much smarter than I am. I flunked out of college twice, so they would never do such a thing.
Well, Harvard and Penn are two pretty tough. Those are tough ones to compete with.
Yeah, and they were, Maisie is not only that, is she's a real beauty. She never missed a party at Harvard. She was the first freshman to be included in the advanced writing class. She can do anything she wants to do. She's always loved country and western music. She's working for an investment film company now, and she's very really good at it, and they really prize having her. But she's now determined to be a country and western singer songwriter. And you know
Hmm.
what? We've known her all our life. She'll succeed. Um, so it's kind of fun being grandpa in these circumstances. Make very little effort and be able to watch these things unrolled.
Anytime I bring my kids over to see my dad, Tom, he says yes to everything, literally everything. So we'll go over there and it'll be like, 9 a.m. and they'll be eating ice pops and ice cream. I'm like, what happened here? They're like, Pop said we can. They call him Pop. Like, Pop said we can. And Dad, come on, man. He's like, I had to be the hard ass with you
Yeah,
guys, with the
yeah, you're
grandkids.
like
Like,
being isolated as the villain.
yeah,
That's right.
he goes, this is all on you. He goes, it's up to you now. He goes, I'm not being the bad guy anymore.
That's great. That's a great story. Well, I think that's kind of traditional with grandparents. I mean, it's much easier to have grandchildren than to have children. The grandchildren just love you because you're their grandparent, and the
Yeah.
children contest you a lot of times. I know mine did, and they still do. They're middle-aged people now.
All right, let's go back to the beginning. Where were you born? And could you describe your family for us? And don't forget your uncles.
I come from a family that are all from Massachusetts, but my father went out to Michigan to work, and so I had a kind of divided uh, growing up because all my grandparents and my cousins were all in Massachusetts, and my mother never got over um, leaving Massachusetts. So every spring she'd load us up in a car and drive us back to the triple decker where all the Irish people live, and and so I have a kind of divided memory of that. But I had a girlfriend in high school whose father was a Wyoming rancher, and I started working on that ranch in the summertime. Um, and I never really wanted to leave the West after I'd been there. And as soon as I got out of school and graduate school, whatever, I just went straight back out West, and I haven't left in 55 years.
And what's the story with your uncles? What's that? What's the
Oh, my
significance there?
uncles? Oh, yeah. I think what Tim's referring to is probably maybe my uncle Frank, who was he was kind of psychologically damaged in World War II. But he was basically a troublemaker anyway and a big drinker. And when my when my grandmother was dying, he was the baby of her family. She said, she said, I want to see Frank before I die. And so we said, well, we'll try to find him. So we drove all around. We found him my brother and I found him in a kind of a flop house hotel. And we went in there and we explained the whole situation to him. We said, you know, grandma's dying probably in a matter of hours, and she just would like to see you one last time. And he was such a cad. He looked at my brother and I, he said, what you don't understand, he said, is sick people depress me.
Oh my gosh.
So he never went to see her. So I always thought that was the coldest thing I ever heard. But he was, you know, he had been an OSS guy in World War II, um, following Germans out of France and communicating with the French collaborators that were telling the Nazis where the were. And uh, he had a great friend he'd enlisted with, and they were going for a walk in the woods, and his friend picked up a Leica camera, and it was booby trapped, and it killed him, and it seems to have scarred him for the rest of his life because from the time he came home from the war, he was really uh, never quite normal. He went to law school. He was a brilliant law student and couldn't pass the bar. And he tried over and over again. It was kind of a disconnect there between a guy who was a good law student and a guy who couldn't pass the bar. So
Hmm.
he's been an enigma to us. We were my brother and I. We were crazy about him because he was so unpredictable. You know, when
Mm-hmm.
we were baseball nuts, and he'd throw the ball for us over and over again, hit fungo bats to us, and so we thought he was the greatest guy in the world, but he was really pretty much of a shit.
I'm glad I didn't specify because that's a great story too, but I was thinking of the judge.
Yeah, he was. That's a that's a. There's a lot I could say about him because we all admired him very much. But he was a very good student, and our family then were Irish, very passionate Irish Catholics. So the church had a big role in their lives back then, and it sort of evaporated. But when he got a full ride scholarship to go to Brown, and the parish priest came around and said, Bill doesn't go to Brown. That's a Protestant school.
Oh my gosh.
So he was discouraged, but he went to Boston College, which was a Catholic college. And after he kind of got his wings, he then went to Harvard Law School, and he graduated. At least by family lore, he graduated first in his class from Harvard Law School after he got to do what he wanted to do. And he was a great guy. My family, we really worshipped him. He was very humorous. One time, my cousin Fred and I went to his court, and there were a bunch of college kids who had been called to justice, we should say, for a panty raid on a girls' college. And so it was time to sentence them, and my Uncle Bill gave him uh, his credit card to Filene's department store in Boston, and he said, I want you three guys to go to the department store, use my credit card, and exhaust your interest in ladies' underwear and come back to the court and report. So,
I wonder if that's ever been done in legal history outside outside of that case.
you're right. I know. He was like that, though. He was really funny, very serious guy. Um, he had this fetish thing, which was he had my cousin Johnny was a little boy, and the neighbor was carrying him around on his shoulders, and he fell, and he got a big, massive bruise on his head, and it got malignant, and they lost that little boy. So my
Oh,
Uncle
wow.
Bill was obsessed with kid safety. I mean, my cousins and I, we were not allowed to have a pocket knife, and we had to sneak around a lot to do what we wanted to do because he was just a constant monitor to make sure nothing bad happened to us.
You had a lot of vivid characters in your personal life. Do they appear in any of your fiction?
I think they do, but I don't feel, I'm not a nonfiction writer, so I use them as needed. You know what I'm saying? In fact, I have to do a public conversation with Hampton Sides. You know who Hampton Sides is? Uh, he's written a lot of narrative, historical novels. Some of them, he's also been number one on the New York Times bestseller list. Um, but I had a question I wanted to ask him, which was, what comes first? Do you do all this research and then you think, oh, there must be a story here, or is it the other way around? I'm going to write about, Robert E. Lee and that, but I don't know anything about him, so I better get down to work. And I'm really anxious to find which comes first with him, whether the general interest or the research produces the narrative. But I think I use my friends somewhat. I'd like to use them more. Now that most of them are dead, I'm sort of free to free to abuse the privilege. I mean, I have a friend, Jim Harrison. You may know his work, and he was such an off the wall guy in ways that you really couldn't write about when he was alive. Um, but I'm more tempted now than I was. That goes for Jimmy Buffett too. There's a lot of stuff you couldn't say when he was alive. I've I've been liberated.
Were you good in school? I know you went to Stanford University, so you must have had at least some academic aspirations.
I had a funny kind of academic career. I flunked out of Michigan State twice, and it was partly just beer and girls, I think, and also I wasn't good at the core curriculum. I didn't have enough self discipline as a student. But at the end of your sophomore year, they would erase if you were still in school, they would erase your performance to that date, and then you get a fresh start. Well, at that point, I was able to do what I wanted to do, which was study English literature and writing. And I went from flunking out over and over again to going on the dean's list and then getting a scholarship to Yale for graduate school. And then I got another scholarship to go to Stanford. I had a It was a classic case. I think a lot of kids. I was a real ADHD kid. In fact, I have to shake off some of that now. I mean, I'm just interested in too much, um, but it was a penalty when you're young and you're expected to buckle down. I mean, I couldn't pass algebra today if I had to. I couldn't then. Couldn't now.
Did you read as a boy? Were your parents readers? What made you want to be a writer?
Um, my parents were readers. My parents were both the first in their families to go to college, but they both studied English in college. We always had a lot of books around the house. I wasn't much of a reader as a really young kid because I was never indoors, and um, uh, I remember my mother uh, gave me a $5 bribe to read a book, and I took the $5 and never read the book. So, but when I got guilty about that when I was about 60. So I said, I got to make good on that deal, and I went and read the book. It was called Penrod and Sam. I still remember. I didn't like it, but they they uh, they were they were literate people. What was curious about our family is that some of them, like my Uncle Bill, were obviously good scholars. My mother and father were pretty good scholars, but all my aunts and my uncles were real blue collar people, and some of the working class family members were the ones I really preferred. Um, so I got a kind of a mixed social class message from my growing up years.
I had to write books with them as the main characters to get them to read.
You had to He had to write books with me and my siblings' names to get us to read.
You get really?
No, I mean he always loved reading, and he would read to us when we were younger. He read to us all the time. But I was kind of felt like you. Like if I had time, I was going to be, whatever, playing football in the yard or playing basketball outside. Or it was hard for me to sit still long enough to read. Now I read, but.
Did you ever cross paths with Toby Wolf or Raymond Chandler?
Toby Wolf. Yes, Toby Wolf's a friend of mine. If we're talking about the same Toby Wolf, he's a master short story writer, and he wrote a book called about his stepfather, but I can't quite. I'll think of the name of it in a minute. And he's a great guy. He was a combat officer in Vietnam, and he's gone on to have an illustrious writing career.
He wrote This Boy's Life.
Yeah, exactly. That's it.
I read both of them extensively. I was introduced to them at dinner parties held by my academic advisor at Syracuse University, and I had a semester of independent study with Toby. He was very kind. I butchered my way through 3 short stories.
That's fascinating. After we get done, I'm going to call Toby and tell him about this conversation. He's just a wonderful guy. I bet he was a really good teacher, Tim. Is that the case?
Yes, he was an excellent teacher.
Yeah, that's good. I'm not surprised. He invited me about 3 or 4 years ago to come out to Stanford because I was one of the Wallace Stegner fellows there. And he was running the Wallace Stegner program for the creative writing thing. And so I went out there. I took my son or my grandson out there. I'm getting all mixed up. Which generation is this anyway? But I took my grandson with me and we walked around. Pretty deluxe place compared to when I was there. They have big meditation buildings, just going. And it was interesting because everybody seems so hyper at Stanford. They're all kind of ambitious. And they had this great big meditation building. It was just supposed to cost tens of millions of dollars. It had little pads where you could sit and you could choose your own music and things to do. There was nobody in there. They're all racing around trying to get rich. And nobody ever went into the meditation building. It probably cost $30 million.
I actually visited Stanford. It was so beautiful, I almost went there instead of Syracuse.
Yes. I got there in the middle 60s, and there was nothing but peach orchards from Palo Alto to San Jose. That's all completely developed now, Silicon Valley. And they were having a cattle branding right on the campus the day I got there. I mean, and I'd never been to California. Like most kids from the Midwest, I thought, this is California. I still remember driving in saying, "Welcome to California." I was kind of mind blown by that. And then I get to this beautiful Spanish style campus, and it was like falling in love. And I've often wondered why I didn't stay in California, but I think fishing sucked me out of there.
My dad, when he did his official visits for football, he went to Stanford just because he was so, he loved the academic side of it. And he said I think it's the most beautiful campus he's ever seen. Right, Dad?
Yeah, it's stunning.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is beautiful. And it doesn't look like any other university either. It's very, old Spanish style and extraordinary.
What did you do immediately after college?
I had $600 left from my fellowship, and I was thinking that I was going to have to get a real job, and I had been trying to publish and not having any success. So I said, I'm going to go up to Montana and I'd submitted a novel. I didn't have high hopes for it. And I said, I'm going to spend all this money trout fishing. So I went up to Montana. And while I was there, I learned that my book had been accepted. So I thought, well, maybe I've dodged a bullet for the short term. And so I rented a room for $28 a month. And, and I said to myself, oh, this is Montana's nice, but as soon as I figure out what I'm going to do with my life, I'll, I'll leave Montana and go do that. And 54 years came and went, and I never made a decision. So that's kind of like life, though. You'd think you're going to decide everything in life, and you're just carried along by circumstances. That was the case. I always wanted to write, so that was a steady thing. And
You ended up in Key West, and I understand that it was a place of dissipation. Is that accurate?
yes, I think it is. It was, it was the '70s. We were kind of hippies, um, sort of hippies. We didn't get haircuts, I guess. And then, and have always been a fishing fanatic, and I got a couple little semi scams together, which was got my when my first book came out, I was able to persuade Sports Illustrated to let me write, and I would get a contract to write X number of stories a year. And at that time, the editor in chief of Sports Illustrated was a man named Andre Laguerre, who was de Gaulle's press secretary during World War II, and he was a very cultivated guy. And he would let you do if he liked your writing, he'd let you do anything you wanted to do. And he had Faulkner writing for him at one point. And this was before the sort of the hard sports wave came in of Texas journalists and completely changed the culture. But there was a little window there when Jim Harrison and Richard Brautigan and I and uh, lots of other kind of literary types who normally wouldn't write for a magazine like Sports Illustrated. We kind of had full reign, and I guided a little bit, and I'd write 5 or 6 pieces for Sports Illustrated or places like that, and I kind of cobbled together a little bit of a living.
So right when you graduated college, you go up to Montana and your book had gotten published. What was that like when you got notice that had happened?
Well, it was you know the literary public likes to discover new people, so you get a little bit of a fake ride in the beginning. So that my work came out, and it was well reviewed. It had a movie sale. The movie got made. It was a low end bestseller, but it was a big bestseller in other countries. It was a huge bestseller in Japan. Go figure.
Hmm.
And, not that that meant I had a big income, but I had a living income, and and that was a complete change for me because I wasn't that young then. I'd been writing since I was a teenager, and I was almost 28 by the time I made my first buck. So I felt pretty liberated. Um, I'd been so disciplined about writing that my nickname was the White Knight. I never did anything bad, and as soon as I got a book out and was free, and I felt uh, confirmed in I became a lunatic. Jimmy Buffett renamed me Captain Berserko. So, and I had a great time for a while, but it was time to get the toothpaste back in the tube. I mean, I was ready for some corrective measures after a few years of that.
How long did it take you to write The Sporting Club? I read somewhere that you almost gave up on it. Is that true?
Well, that's almost sort of true, but the second book that I wrote, that I published, was called The Bushwick Piano. And that one, I wasn't having any luck finding a home for that. And I was pretty desperate. And I wrote The Sporting Club very quickly. I wrote it in a month and a half. And, and I sent it to Jim Harrison, and he was working at a university in New York, and he knew a lot of publishing people, and he passed it on, and Simon & Schuster bought it. So it was a couple of lucky things that happened, and it doesn't happen to every writer. I mean, there's some good writers who don't ever get a break. I mean, it's sort of famously true. It's like Van Gogh never sold a painting. I mean, this can happen. It's not fair, but that's the way it is.
How did you get the news?
Well, it was a. I'll kind of wind the tape back because I just foreshorten it to say I was already in Montana. But here's what happened: I went down to Mexico, uh, and to Baja California, and I was. Uh, I had sent the book to Jim Harrison, and I was sure nothing good was going to happen with it. But I was going to go down there and sort of think about my life and think what I was going to do next. And I had sent out a lot of letters looking for jobs, and none of them produced results. And while I was in Mexico, I was sleeping on the beach in San Felipe, Baja California, and it was like daybreak. And I looked up, and there was this heavyset Mexican guy coming down. He was wearing Ray-Bans, and he had a 45 on his hip, and he came walking down the beach, and I was in a sleeping bag, and I sat up. I didn't know what was happening, if I was being kidnapped or what. And he reached out his hand and he said, "Congratulations, your book has been accepted." And he was the the Western Union operator in San Felipe, Mexico. And my wife had sent this telegram down there, and somehow or another he found me out on the beach. I guess he knew where all the gringos were sleeping. so, so yes, it was very dramatic for me, and in the context was that I had kind of accepted the idea that my writing dream wasn't gonna pan out. So it was a 180 on the line of scrimmage.
What do you think you'd have done if you didn't get that first book published? Do you think you would have gone back to the drawing board?
Well, not completely, because I have then and ever since have had a very strong interest in literature, not just as a reader, but um, as kind of a student of literature. And I could easily have gone on and taught English literature, and I would have liked it. It wouldn't have been a disaster.
It wouldn't have been a disaster. It's such a great way to say it.
That's funny. I agree. That's funny. Back in those days, or at least in the people you knew, I mean, it would seem pretty far fetched to set out as a young person and say, "I'm going to be a writer." You definitely got no support from home. My parents thought it was crazy. I remember my father, who was a tough old bird, he said to me, "Who do you think you are? Ernest Hemingway?" And I said to him, because I was a smart ass, I said to him, "If I couldn't write any better than that, I'd give up." Of course, I loved Hemingway. Just clashing with the parental figure there.
Yeah.
Did you get an agent right away?
Yes, I did. I had a really famous agent, Candida Donadio. I can't remember how I got her, but after about 5 or 6 years, I discovered she was stealing from me. And I had sold something, maybe it was 92 in the Shade, to a movie company. And Candida Donadio had a boyfriend. He was a real flamboyant guy who drove around New York with a big cigar and a Rolls Royce. And the producer of the movie, who had bought my book, came to see me, and he said, "Do you realize that before we could buy your book, we had to pay off the boyfriend, and it was a big, big price."
Oh, gosh.
And so I said I didn't know that was going on. I thought I'd had a nice movie sale, but it was missing $250,000 or something at that point. So I fired her, and there was a kid in her office who was doing all the work anyway. So he became my agent, and he went around, joined another agency, and then he just quit and went and did something else. So I had to start over. But I ended up with Andrew Wiley, in New York, and he's a great agent for my kind of writing.
I always hate hearing people getting taken advantage of by agents. It seems like everyone has a horror story. Hey, did you ever meet Hemingway? I don't know when he died and if you two would have ever crossed paths.
Oh no, I didn't. I never did meet him, but I had when I was in Key West, one of my really good friends there. His father was Hemingway's personal guy, who was a guy from Arkansas who had kind of come into his life by way of his second wife. And the house was full of Hemingway stuff. It's all his African rifles and um, uh, just. So I heard a lot of inside stuff about Hemingway, but the one thing that really blew me away, my friend whose father worked for Hemingway gave me this notebook that Hemingway had kept when he went with his grandmother to Europe when he was 11 years old, and uh, he wrote everything about what he was seeing on the ship, and he was just a little kid. It was all in the famous Hemingway style. He already had that style as a kid.
How did cocaine change the landscape back then?
I don't know how it did, except it was everywhere, and I think I think it probably ruined drinking for people because people would they'd do cocaine and then they'd have to have 5 cocktails to get rid of the effects of cocaine. In the end, people found that they didn't do it. They didn't like cocaine. I know I did it back in the day, and then I didn't like alcohol either. So I'm not sure how it changed the landscape, except at least among the people I know, it's just not there anymore. Although I think it's a big presence in the world. It was everywhere in the '70s. It's even in Woody Allen movies. So,
Tom, you have accomplished so many incredible things. I'm still just happy we're getting to talk to you.
well, you know, I couldn't, in my greatest fantasy, in my dream world, I couldn't have done what you've done. And so I think all these things are, you know, I got to back up a little bit. I met John Cheever long ago, and I said, what is the goal in life?" And he said, "I can answer that simply: it's to be useful." And that really rings a bell with me, but it didn't always. I thought the goal was to have a good time or to get famous or something like that. But no, I'm old now, but at this point in time, I just really want to be useful, and I think that's what you're doing, and I'm sure that's what you want to do. But that's how you graduated first in your class at Syracuse. You wanted to be useful, and I think Troy better be useful. He's got 4 kids. We're going to run him ragged. So, anyway, I don't know if you're kind of winding down. It sounds like that, but this has been such a pleasure. I hope we get to meet in 3D.
When I asked about cocaine earlier, I really meant to ask how it changed the landscape in Key West specifically.
The landscape. Oh, it sure did. First of all, all the city officials got into the business, and then it was very different. I mean, when I first was in Key West, it was a kind of a mild. Somebody said it was all about pot, sailboats, and acoustic guitars. And then after cocaine arrived, it was a lot of guns, a lot of violence, a lot of Cubans, and I left Key West in 1978, and I remember thinking it was the creepiest place I'd ever been by that time. It was the most delightful place I'd been when I first got there, and it was that way for a long time. But we were such fishermen. I mean, we were hardly ever on the rock. We were out on the ocean all the time, and so some of the deterioration we missed. But and it's come back. I mean, I know people are still there, and they say those bad old days have never returned. But cocaine drove the bad old days. There's no question about it.
How did you get the news that someone wanted to make 92 in the Shade into a movie?
Well, it was the 92 in the Shade uh, project was really strange, and I'll tell you how strange. They United Artists bought the film rights, and the director was assigned director was Robert Altman, who's one of my favorite directors. And Altman and I drove all the way around. We traveled around. We did all the scene and site selections for the movie. We got all through with that. Movie was financed. It was green lighted, and Altman and the producer got into a almost knockdown, drag out argument. And the producer fired Altman, or Altman quit. I can't remember which. But in any case, when that happened, the financing was in place, and the producer said to me, we got to make the movie. And I said, well, you don't have a director. He said, yes, we do. It's you. So I didn't know what to do. I thought I better buy a book about how to be a movie director. And so that's how I ended up directing. I never wanted to be a director. And after I was done, we brought it in on time and under budget, and it's still out. It's still circulating. But I never wanted to do it again. I mean, my commitment was always to the printed page, and it still is.
Carl had a funny line about that in episode 23. Something like, throw them your script, get the money, and don't look back. Anyway, can you tell us what made you stop drinking? I've heard you talk about this a little bit, but wanted to give you an opportunity to expand on it.
I think, yeah, I don't know why, but my daughter was born, and I remember thinking that I, like everybody I knew, was drank too much. We'd have 5 big cocktails at night and think that was normal, and or maybe we'd go to lunch and have a bunch of cocktails. So anyway, this was 1982, I think, or something. And I thought, well, this is no way to live if you're raising a young child. And so I just stopped. I mean, I probably had all the symptoms of alcoholism in terms of personality change, all those things. I didn't seem to have a deep addiction to it, because once I quit, I didn't really want to do it anymore. But I'm not letting myself off the hook on the question of alcoholism, because you can be an alcoholic just because you're a bad drunk, not because you're addicted or really need to drink. And I didn't need to, but I was definitely could be pretty unpleasant. My mother, father, and sister died in a short window, and I used to be practically a non-drinker. I was very moderate until I was in my 30s. But after those 3 deaths, I just couldn't handle alcohol anymore. And then my little girl was born, and the whole collection said, give this up.
Thank you for your honesty with that. I know it's a personal thing for most people. I heard you say that your wife, Lori, is incredibly observant. Has that rubbed off on you? And if it has, do you think it has made you a better writer?
Oh, yes. I mean, I kind of live almost. I was always a daydreamer as a kid. I spent a lot of time in my head, and Laurie is really anchored. So she doesn't miss anything, and she has a perfect sense of direction. We used to go out in the national forest down here and up in Montana, wander around. I'd be completely lost, and Laurie would know exactly where she was. And it has to do with the level of mindfulness of really paying attention to what you're looking at, where instead of your mind going off and being reminded of things and so on. And I'm still working on that one. For example, I'll meet somebody and walked 20 feet away. I can't remember their names. And I'm now learning that it's because I wasn't paying attention in the first place when I heard their names. But Laurie wouldn't make that mistake. She'd right there in her own shoes and doesn't have this kind of fantasizing artistic problem.
Who are your top authors you like to read for pleasure?
I don't know that I have an answer to that. I read a lot of cutting edge fiction writers, some of whom are a little bit uh, extreme for me. But I was a big fan of Alice Munro's. I read everything of Alice Munro's, and I do a lot of rereading at this age, to see if I still uh, like the things that I have liked through my life. Um, uh, I have a funny relationship with Hemingway because there are a couple of his books that I absolutely loved, and I'm sure, influenced me. And except for those, I don't like anything he wrote. But I mean, the stories In Our Time and then Farewell to Arms had a big impact on me. But some of the books after, The Old Man and the Sea, I don't even like. I mean, I just like those two books, and they were bullseyes. So I read him, and I read Faulkner. I had a big period when I read a lot of John Steinbeck. Um, but I'm in a sort of a rereading phase now, except for something will jump out at me. I'm reading this book that I've got to do an open conversation with by Hampton Sides, and he's an excellent writer. Somebody told me this is advice for old people, that as you start to option off from reading fiction to reading nonfiction, it's a sort of a bad sign because it means that your ability to track all those uh, characters in your memory is declining, and so you'll read, about Teddy Roosevelt in San Juan Hill or something. It's a much easier thing to follow, but it's a good exercise for older people to continue to read novels because there's so much you have to keep track of in your memory, and it's good exercise. So I'm kind of doing that, but otherwise I had kind of drifted off into reading a lot of nonfiction.
Did you have a book that you loved when you were younger and don't like it anymore, or the other way around, something you didn't really like when you were younger and when you go back and read it, you really appreciated it?
Yes, there's one. There's a book by Samuel Butler. It's kind of an English classic called The Way of All Flesh, and I read it probably in my 20s, and it had a huge impact for me. I was emotionally very moved by this book. But 2 years ago, I decided to reread it. I didn't like anything about it. And I remember thinking, what happened? And I found it almost unreadable. But I forced my way to go through it, and I thought, boy, I'm glad I don't have to do that again. So I don't understand what happened between the two readings, but that's. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does.
Sometimes I'll read a book that seemed to me flawless at the time, like Huckleberry Finn. That is a great book, obviously, but the end of it, where Tom Sawyer is playing moronic tricks on the slave Jim, stuff like that, really ruined the book for me the last time I read it. But I still like most of it. Great book that had a big influence on me was The Moviegoer by Walker Percy. Um, and the last time I read it, it has a section right toward the end that just seems to me to be a huge mistake. Um, I didn't notice that the first time I read it. Uh, so I think your taste changes, and maybe you get experienced, get smarter about what you're reading. I really don't know.
Did you ever read Master and Commander?
No, but I should. Are you recommending it? Is that the C books by the what is the Master and Commander? I can't remember what it was.
I've got to cheat and look it up. It says Master and Commander novel by Patrick O'Brien.
Oh yeah, the O'Brien books. I haven't. You know what? Those are. Everybody says they're so addictive, and I really have never gotten started on it. But somebody says if you get started, you're in for 30 volumes or something.
That's the one. I read the whole series 5 times and absolutely love it. I highly recommend it.
Wow. Okay, I'll get started.
I report back.
I'll report back exactly. I know how addictive they are. That's probably why I've kind of avoided them. Everybody I know who's ever read them reads the whole series.
It really is that good. Tom, I'm a bit of a fanatical Christian. It has helped me make sense of life with ALS. You grew up in an Irish Catholic family. Did you ever have a crisis that made you dust off that Bible?
Nothing. I've never turned to religion, I guess is what I would have to say. I mean, I was, you know, I was raised with nuns hitting me with triangular rulers. So um, I'm not very religious, though. I think I'm pretty spiritual. But, the idea of a deity as described to me when I was young is long gone. I just read a book that absolutely fascinated me. It was a writer named David Eagleton. I don't know if that rings a bell. Um, he's the neuroscientist at Stanford, and he wrote a book called Sum. Um, and it's a list of all the bizarre possibilities that exist in the afterlife. And one of them is his position is that we know so little about the brain and we know so little about the universe, which is, so far as we can tell, infinite. He said that nobody in the world can legitimately know enough to be an atheist. And since the book came out, he's been attacked by a lot of very literate atheist authors who have responded to his book, but a lot of them have sort of given in to his point of view. And his basic feeling is that the possibilities of creation in an infinite universe and the little that we know about what the brain does. We know a lot about what the brain does, but there's probably 80% of it is unknown to us. And he said that combination means that the possibilities of life now or post mortem are infinite. You might like that book. Take a look at it. I absolutely loved it.
Yeah, I'm looking it up now.
Yeah, and he was profile had a great profile in the New Yorker. I wrote my brother-in-law Buffett. I wrote him a letter that we sent to him. I think his last day of his life, or the last 2 days of his life, and he was very religious at one point. He as an altar boy. He said more masses than anybody in the history of Alabama. Um, but I said, even the Neanderthals were convinced there was something else than what we know in sort of our finite lives. I said, I don't know how skeptical you are about the afterlife and things like that. I said, I'm just telling you, you need to leave the door ajar because we don't know anything. And he had my niece read it to him, I think the last day of his life, 2 or 3 times. I mean, there's lots more I put in it, but I basically said, you have to trust the unknown.
Let's talk about riding. Are you just a natural, or maybe you had to toil at it?
Riding horses, like everything else, you can break down into the components that are involved in doing it. Um, Riding cutting horses, I was a steer roper. I used to go to ropings and rodeos and stuff, and then I get more interested in what horses know and what horses can do. And the relationship you have with a horse if you ride or train cutting horses is very intricate and it's very subtle. Um, for example, if you go to a cutting horse contest and you're in a bad mood, the horse is going to know about it and you're going to lose the contest. Um, there's so much mind control about it, so much sensitivity about horses. Um, as another intelligence, another kind of intelligence, that you really have to retrain your mind as well as all the things you do when you're riding these horses, because you have to see the world through their eyes and they have to see the world through your eyes, or you really can't compete. I sometimes think, here's a football analogy. You take you take Nick Saban, who rules with an iron hand, and you move him to the Miami Dolphins, where the iron hand doesn't work, and he looks like he doesn't know what he's doing. And this is a little bit, horses are a little bit like college football players. You have to be in a kind of a mental relationship with them. Like Pete, what's his name at the Seattle? These coaches that really know how to get into the heads of people in other ways than dominating them. And that's what cutting horses are like.
Working on a ranch, you have buried a lot of animals that I bet you loved. Do you think that has given you perspective on your own mortality?
100%. On the ranch, we have an area where we bury our dogs and horses and stuff like that. And, my friend Jim Harrison wrote the greatest poem about death. And I'll have to send it to you. I'll send it to you, Troy, and you can pass it on. It's just a great piece. We lost a grandchild, and I read it at his funeral. And he said, the pitch about it is that there's nothing more ordinary than death. And it's like, it's hard. I won't paraphrase it. I'm going to send it to you because he does it. He does such a brilliant job of talking about the exceptionalism of mortality and its ordinariness. I mean, I always think of the thing they say in South Americans say, which is, everybody knows they're going to die, but nobody believes it. So, and plus the process is kind of random. I mean, in a funny way, you just, you wonder how these things happen. And if you have a strong impulse, religious impulse, then you feel it's part of an overriding plan. And, if you have a lot of religious conviction, you don't think anything is random. It's all by some sort of superior intelligence why things happen. But I think people, if you look at the slaughter in Gaza or something like that, you can't believe that that's purposeful on some sort of theological level. It's just terrible stuff. Terrible things happen. There's a great question, Tim, about, burying dogs and horses and animals, and in some cases friends. My book is dedicated to 3 of my oldest friends, and none of them are alive anymore. And the book is coming out this year. And so one time I have a ranching partner. He ranches right across the road from us, and he's a real old time rancher. And I said to him, Stuart, one of these days, Laurie's going to call you up and say, Tom didn't wake up. And they said, yeah, what about it? I said, well, I just wondered if you mind stopping over with your backhoe. And he said, no problem, Tom. So yes, you do learn a lot. That's a great question, and you do learn a lot from those events.
Please tell us about your kids and feel free to brag.
Well, they're all so different from each other. There's no generational uniformity. My son went to a 2-room schoolhouse. He was dyslexic and left-handed. And he's a really smart, capable person. But by the time he got through the 8th grade, he thought there was something wrong with him because he was learning impaired, really. But he started making things using his hands, and he's a master bladesmith. He trained in Japan under a national treasure guy, and he's been on the cover of Blade magazine 2 or 3 times, and he does everything through his hands, and he's the son of a literary person. That's not his drive at all. Um, my my daughter Maggie is she's an animal rescue person, flies around all around the world with airplanes, working for these organizations that do that. She's rescued tens of thousands of dogs from all sorts of places. Then she went to, after the earthquakes in Turkey, she was in there working on the feed lines there. She's very idealistic about stuff. Married to a wonderful guy who was John Mayer, the guitarist, sort of producer. And my daughter Annie's sort of a wild card. She's got way too many tattoos. She's just sort of a unpredictable, sweet person. So that's 3 of them. Now my stepdaughter Heather, Laurie's daughter, when we were first married, of the kids, she's probably the one I'm closest to. But she's also the one that shares the most interests with me. She's a reader and a sort of a literary person. Um, so those are the kids.
What a diverse group. My
They're
sister's like
diverse.
that with the animals. My sister is a vet. She's always, since we were as young as I can remember, always helping animals, every animal, every and any animal.
That's great. Well, you're probably an animal guy too, right? You have a dog?
My parents have a couple of dogs. I don't have nothing compared to her. I mean,
What is your
sometimes
sister? What's her name?
my older sister Tussa, the one that went to school with your
Okay, Tessa.
granddaughter, yeah,
It's-
that's Tate. Tate's the one that went to Harvard, and Tussa's the vet.
Okay. And
Yeah,
Kate is the one that Maisie knows.
yeah,
Kate.
Tate with a T, like
Oh, the
Tate.
T. Okay, I'll
Yeah,
tell Maisie that we talked about it. To which one is married to the football player or the hockey player?
Tate is my younger
Kate.
sister. Yes,
Yeah.
her husband. They met at Harvard.
Yeah. Wow. Looking at my picture over here, I really get a red face. Am I spending too much time in the sun? I look like one of my Irish uncles who had a big drinking problem. Always had a red face.
Now, on to our final word segment where we ask our guests a few rapid fire questions. What was the happiest moment in your life?
It's kind of a tie, but when each of my kids were born, I really can't match that with anything else. And Yeah, that's probably it. When the kids were born, just that excitement. I'm sure you feel the same way.
What is the biggest adversity you've faced?
Oh, probably a combination of family deaths, alcohol, and failure, recurring failure. So, in the first third of my life, just nothing working out year after year after year. So I think that's pretty close to the right answer.
What are you most excited about?
I'm right. I have a book coming out. I'm proofreading it now. I'm excited to see if at this late age I can still write. And I've re-signed my contract with the New Yorker, so I'm betting that I can. But I think that's it. I mean, I have these kind of things that I do that I just like to do that are fun, and I'm really a really avid fisherman, and I like to fish in places I've never seen before. I spent this last year I was in Norway and different places, standing in rivers, getting washed away twice. I should be a little more sensible about how old I actually am, but I just keep doing that. and I can at any given moment I can close my eyes and picture a fishing trip I'd like to do. Um, so that's what I look for. Those two things really, and then just this is something I'm sure Tim can identify with. It's just kind of uh, very absorbing to see how your children and your grandchildren are going to go forward in their lives, and even to the degree you look at it and say, imagine what they'll be doing and how they'll represent your values after you're not in the picture. I mean, those are all things that are pretty absorbing for Tim. Tim's not old enough, but I mean, at my age, that's the kind of thing you think about a lot.
The next one is, what advice would you give your younger self?
My younger self, um, calm down. That would be it. Just calm down. I was always so hyper and driven and stuff like that, and impatient. Still very impatient. I think my younger self would say is, decide what you want to do, and it's one step at a time. Don't just be mad because you can't get there in a minute. And they're not mad, but frustrated.
Yeah. Next one is, do you have any book recommendations for us or for the listeners?
Well, I'm recommending to everybody that book I just described to you, David Eagleman, Sum, SUM. I think I'll leave it at that because I'd have to go scratching around to think of something that really moved me as much as that has recently. So imaginative. Several really high level people have said it's just an absolute work of genius. It's only about 120 pages long, 150 pages long. It'll definitely change your mind about a lot of things. And because it's not a nut, he's not a nut by any stretch. I mean, he's a neuroscientist, but he was like a dirt biker at one point, and then he thought he studied English in college, thought he wanted to be a writer, and then it didn't work out. Then he thought he would be a screenwriter, and that didn't work out. And then he thought he would be a stand-up comedian, and that didn't work out. So he went back to school, and now he's one of the leading neurosurgeons in the world. Wow. So he has a basis in his, kind of life experience. It's very different than other scientists, and yet he's a top scientist.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
And then the last question is, the name of this podcast is Nothing Left Unsaid. Do you have anything that you want to say?
No, I just want to say that I'm kind of moved by this experience and touched because I think Tim's struggle is heroic, but it's also of a piece with the part of his life that he lived before he was struck by ALS. And to have something as monumental as that leave you undeterred is something that is really worth aspiring to. So, I got to think of something stronger than my compliments. I want to just say, I admire you very much, and thanks for talking to me.
I absolutely love hearing your stories. I could talk to you for another few hours, but we'll let you go. I'll have to read the very few books and stories of yours that I haven't read yet.
Well, let's meet sometime.
Yeah, I'll shoot you an email when we stop recording when we're going to be down in Florida.
Oh, yeah, great. Love to see you if you can get this way.
Tom McGuane, it has been an honor to get to talk to you. Thank you for your valuable time today. May God continue to bless you and your family.
Thank you, Tim. Same to you goes double.
Thanks, Tom. It was really great to get to know you here for the short time, and hopefully we get together in person.
I do too. This has been sweet. So let's try to make that happen.
Today's episode is brought to you by the ALS Investment Fund, a specialized biotech venture capital investment firm focused on neurodegenerative diseases, particularly ALS. They manage a large and diversified worldwide portfolio of ALS-related companies, collaborating with a global network of scientists, clinicians, foundations, and patient advocates to accelerate therapeutic development. Investing for a World Without ALS. Discover more about their mission and impact at alsinvestmentfund.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, consider supporting the podcast for free by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform, leaving a review, and sharing it with your friends. Your support means the world to us. This episode of Nothing Left Unsaid is brought to you by 11 Labs. Their groundbreaking technology makes a huge difference, and we're grateful for their support. To learn more, visit 11labs.io. A substantial portion of our sponsorship proceeds go to tackleals.com, funding cutting-edge ALS research. If you'd like to join the fight and contribute, visit tackleals.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time on Nothing Left Unsaid.